Hello everyone, and welcome to the official How to Play Anime Villainous guide. My name is Chaos in the Sky, and today I'll be walking you through all of the basics that you need to know to start playing the fan project board game, Anime Villainous. Anime Villainous is based on the popular Villainous products by Ravensburger, such as Disney Villainous and Marvel Villainous. Utilizing several of the concepts that make the franchise of board games so popular while adding its own unique spin, Anime Villainous keeps the core idea of Villainous while adding new twists to make it feel like a fresh experience. If you're thinking that you need to have some knowledge of other Villainous properties to understand this one, don't worry. This video assumes you know nothing about any form of Villainous, and will tell you everything that you need to know to start playing, even the most basic concepts. So let's get started. After you've loaded up Anime Villainous in Tabletop Simulator, you'll see a selection of villains in the center of the table here. Just grab and pull out a copy of the selector to choose which villain you'd like to play as. For this video, we're going to be using Orochimaru from the Naruto franchise, because it's one of my personal favorite anime and manga series. Something else to note is that you'll see some boxes containing strength tokens and showdown tokens. There will be times in the game where characters have their strength values modified, either gaining strength or losing strength. You'll need these tokens to place on them to keep track of the changes. The Showdown tokens are part of the end game in Anime Villainous, and I'll talk more about them when I explain Showdown near the end of the video. There's also the Fate token, which is meant for games that involve 4 or more players. I'll talk about that later as well. Once you've chosen your villain, it will spawn in everything you need to play as them. You'll have your villain's territory, represented by this board. To the left of the territory will be a 30-card villain deck, and to the right of it will be a 15-card Fate deck. You'll also have a villain mover placed over the portrait on your territory, a power counter above your villain deck, and a villain guide beneath the territory. The villain guide contains a plethora of important details and information about the villain you're playing as. If you're unfamiliar with a villain's playstyle and unique rules, you should read through it before playing the game. Otherwise, you can set the villain guide aside, as it isn't actually needed for playing the game. Some villains may also have additional bits and pieces included if their gameplay calls for it. There are some villains that can have unique tiles, or tokens, or maybe even a third deck of some kind. Any villains with unique attributes such as that will have those things explained in their villain guides. I'll also be uploading individual how-to videos for each villain in the game that will go more in depth for any sort of special setups. The first thing we're going to look at is the villain's territory. Here you see that you have a portrait of your villain on the leftmost side, which is where your mover begins at the start of the game. The mover represents where your villain currently is, and you'll use it to go to different locations to do different things throughout the game. Your villain's portrait has your villain's objective listed just beneath the villain's name. The objective is what your villain is working towards, and you have to accomplish said objective to be able to win the game. The villain's guide will specify how exactly to accomplish their objective. Beneath the objective, we have something unique to Anime Villainous, your villain's ability. A villain ability is something that is always in effect, and changes the villain's gameplay accordingly. Abilities can be very simple or very complex, and they can also potentially be either a help or a hindrance to your villain, depending. Villain abilities are very important, so make sure you pay close attention to what each villain's ability can do for them. The last thing to note about the portrait is that at the bottom left of your villain's ability is a strength value. All villains have a strength value which is used for a mechanic in Anime Villainous called clashing. We'll talk more about that later in the video. To the right of the portrait are the 4 locations in your villain's territory. Each location has its own unique name and picture, with different actions at each location, indicated by these circles. Whenever you start your turn in Anime Villainous, you'll move your mover to a new location to take actions there. You cannot choose to stay at the location you're at when your turn starts, unless a card says otherwise. When you start a game of Anime Villainous, you shuffle your villain and Fate deck, then draw 4 cards from the top of your villain deck. At the end of every turn, you'll draw back up to 4 cards in your hand, unless another card says otherwise. If you ever need to draw from your villain deck but there are no cards left, shuffle your villain deck's discard pile to make your deck again and draw from it. This same rule applies to your villain's Fate deck. If it's ever empty and someone needs to draw from it, you shuffle the discard pile to make the Fate deck again. The order of a turn in Anime Villainous goes like this. When you start your turn, you move your villain's mover to a new location. Once there, you take as many or as few actions as you want at that location, in whatever order you like. After that, you can enter your clash phase, which is completely optional, and I'll explain later in the video. Then you end your turn and draw until your hand has 4 cards in it again. After that, the next player takes their turn, and so on until it's your turn once again. Now we're going to cover the different types of cards in Anime Villainous. As mentioned, we have 2 different decks, the Villain deck and the Fate deck. They both have several card types in them that you'll need to understand to play the game. Let's start by looking at the card types found in the Villain deck. The cards in the Villain deck will have a cost associated with playing them that you can find at the top left of the card. Most commonly, cards will cost anywhere from 0 to 3 power, but some cards in certain decks can have higher or even variable costs. We'll talk more about how you gain power to then spend on cards after we go through all the card types. The most common card type you'll typically see in the Villain deck are effect cards. They'll have some kind of ability to help your villain further their goals. After using the effect card, it is then discarded to your Villain deck discard pile next to your Villain deck. Next, we have ally cards, which are various henchmen and assistants that help your villain with their goals. Allies will be placed at the bottom of your territory at a location of your choosing. They can be moved to other locations by certain actions later in the game. Some allies have specific abilities that help you further your goals, and some are just meant to help you defeat heroes that may get in your way. You'll also see that ally cards have a strength value on them, which is the number at the bottom left of the card. This shows how strong your ally is, which will be important when having them take on heroes. The next card type is items, which are usually used in one of 2 ways. There are items that you play to a location in your territory, similarly to allies, and have some sort of ability that can help you through the game. Or, there are items that you attach to another card, rather than playing it on its own. The item will specify who you can attach it to, as depending on the item they can be attached to either allies, heroes, or even your villain. Something important to note is that if you attach an item to your villain, then you place it beneath the villain portrait. That item is considered to be at the same location as your villain's mover. These next 2 card types are unique to Anime Villainous. First, we have schemes, which are very unique in how they're used. When you play a scheme, you choose an opponent to target with it. You then place that scheme over your target's portrait. The scheme will have a trigger that the player you targeted will have to perform, seen at the top of the card's text. When the targeted player activates the trigger of the scheme, or schemes, played to them, those schemes immediately have their effect resolved, if able, during that player's turn. After a scheme has been triggered, whether its effect was able to be resolved or not, it is then discarded to the Villain deck discard pile of the player that originally played the scheme. Lastly, we have forms, which are cards that change your villain's unique ability and strength value. Forms stand out compared to other cards because the picture and text are inverted from how cards are normally. They still have a cost just like any other card, which will be at the top left of the actual picture of the card. Like allies, they'll also have a strength value at the bottom left of the text portion of the card. When you play a form, you put it just beneath the objective of your villain portrait, so that it covers your villain's original ability and strength. While a form is in play, your ability is replaced with the form's ability, so you cannot use your original ability. Your strength value is also changed to whatever the strength value of the form is. Forms will usually have some sort of trigger that will cause them to be discarded if the trigger is met, putting you back to your original ability and strength value. Also, if you play a form when you already have one in play, you discard your current form and replace it with the new one. You cannot choose to discard your current form. It is only discarded when you meet the removal trigger or play a new form. That's it for the Villain deck. Now we're going to go over the card types you can find in the Fate deck. Unlike the Villain deck, cards in the Fate deck have no cost because they'll actually be played by your opponents using a Fate action. We'll talk about Fate actions in just a minute. First, let's cover these card types. Just like with the Villain deck, the Fate deck can have both effect and item cards in it. They work the same as they would in the Villain deck. Effects can be played for one-time abilities that typically slow down your villain. Items, meanwhile, can be attached to heroes to make them stronger, or to your villain or allies to hamper them in some way. Next in the Fate deck, we have heroes, which are similar to ally cards. While heroes have no cost, they do have a strength value, and unique abilities that will slow down the villain they're opposing. Unlike allies, heroes are played to the top of the villain's territory. Also, unlike allies, heroes will actually cover the top actions of the location they're at. You can see by the outline at the top of a location where the hero card is supposed to be covering. If an action is covered by a hero, you cannot use those actions when you move to that location. The last thing we have for the Fate deck is another unique addition to Anime Villainous, the Challenge. A villain's challenge is easy to recognize because its picture and text are horizontal on the card. Each villain has one challenge in their Fate deck, and it's one of the hardest hitting cards in it. When a challenge is played against a villain, it's placed above their Fate deck. The challenge then stays there with its effect active until the villain performs whatever overcome is listed on the bottom of the card's text. When the challenge is overcome, it is discarded back to the villain's Fate discard pile, where it could potentially be played again later. That's all of the standard card types you'll be seeing in Anime Villainous. There are some unique card types that can be found on specific villains, but those will be covered in their individual how-to videos. Next, we're going to go over the actions that you'll use to actually interact with all the various cards in the game. As mentioned earlier, the circles found at locations in your territory are what we call actions. First, we have the Gain Power action. As you'd expect, this action lets you gain the amount of power that it shows. Typically, that'll either be 1, 2, or 3 power. You add this number to your power counter, which is above your villain deck. Next, we have the Play a Card action. In Anime Villainous, you can't just play cards whenever you want, even if you have enough power to play them. To play cards, you need the Play a Card action, which lets you play one card. The next action is the Discard Cards action. Much like you can't just play cards in Anime Villainous without an action, you can't discard cards either. This action allows you to discard as many cards as you like from your hand. Then we have the Move, Item, or Ally action. I mentioned earlier you play your allies and items to specific locations in Anime Villainous. If you ever need to move them from one location to another, this action allows you to move them to an adjacent location. Keep in mind that it's only adjacent locations, and also that if an item is attached to an ally, moving that ally will also move the item along with them. There's also a Move Hero action, which does the same as the Move, Item, or Ally action, but to a hero instead. Only one villain in Anime Villainous has this action as of the first box, so I'll talk about it more in that villain's individual how-to video. These next 3 actions need a bit more explanation. First up, we have the Vanquish action. This action is used to get rid of heroes in your territory. When you use a Vanquish action, you can have allies that are at the same location as a hero defeat that hero for you. When you perform a Vanquish action, the strength value of your allies has to be equal to or higher than the hero they're trying to defeat. You can use as many or as few allies as you want when defeating a hero, but you can only defeat one hero with one Vanquish action. After you've done your Vanquish action, you discard the hero and all the allies used to their respective discard piles. Next, we have the Activate action. The Activate action is used to, as you can probably imagine, activate special abilities of some cards. You'll see the same Activate symbol on allies or items that your villain can play to their territory. Not every villain will have the Activate action. Some villains use it, and some just don't. You may also see some cards with an Activate symbol that requires you to pay power or something similar. You must still use an Activate action to use this ability, as well as the extra requirement listed on the card. An example of activates that also cost something like power is Orochimaru's item for Violet Barrier. And an example of an activate that needs nothing but the action itself is Orochimaru's ally Sakon and Ukon. The final action we have is the Fate action. This is one of the most important actions in the game, and it can get a little complex, so I'll be giving some examples for this one. In Anime Villainous, you have a choice of 2 different things to do when using the Fate action. The first option we'll cover is to target a player with the Fate action. We'll use Orochimaru and Father for this example. When Orochimaru uses his Fate action to target Father, he'll reveal 2 cards from the top of Father's Fate deck. Orochimaru will then choose one Fate card to discard, and the other card to play to Father's territory. Keep in mind that if one of the cards is unplayable, then Orochimaru has to play the card that is playable. It's unlikely, but entirely possible for both cards drawn from the Fate deck to be unplayable. If that happens, then it just means the player that was targeted got lucky. You discard both Fate cards and continue the game as normal. This is what we typically call a normal Fate action. However, in Anime Villainous, you actually have another option when fating your opponent. This time we'll add in Merrick and All for One for the example. When you Fate, you can choose to do something called a multi-Fate. In this case, when Orochimaru does his Fate action, rather than revealing 2 cards from one villain's Fate deck, instead he'll reveal 1 Fate card from every other villain's Fate deck. After revealing the top card from every villain's Fate deck, Orochimaru chooses 1 card to play and discards the other cards to their respective discard piles. Orochimaru then plays the chosen Fate card to the territory of the villain whose Fate deck he drew it from. Something else important to know about is the fate token I mentioned near the start of the video. If you're playing a game with 4 or more people, you use the fate token. This token is given to the last player who was targeted by a fate action, and it means they can't be fated again until the token moves to someone else. In the case of multi-fating, where every player is targeted, the player that had a fate card played against them gets the token. If a multi-fate results in nothing but unplayable cards, the person performing the fate action still has to choose a player to give the fate token to, even if no fate card was played. Also, if a player chooses to multi-fate when another player has the fate token, you do not reveal a card from the top of that player's fate deck. Instead, you reveal a card from the top of every other player's fate deck and complete the multi-fate action as usual. Another important thing to note is that you can actually multi-fate even if you're playing a 1v1 game of Anime Villainous. All this means is that you only reveal 1 card from the top of your opponent's fate deck instead of 2 cards. This can be very useful if your opponent's fate deck is down to just a few more cards, and you know there are some strong heroes or the challenge coming up next. That covers all of the actions in the game. Remember that when you move to a location, you may take any of the actions that aren't covered by a hero at that location, in whatever order you want. All actions are optional. You do not have to use an action at your location if you don't want to. There are only 2 more things we need to cover, and then you'll be ready to dive into Anime Villainous. These last 2 mechanics, Clashing and Showdown, are unique to Anime Villainous and add a lot to the gameplay. We'll talk about Clashing first, which is similar to Vanquishing. You probably remember way back at the start of this video where I pointed out that your villain has a strength value of their own, just like heroes and allies do. As you can probably guess, that means your villain is able to defeat heroes as well. However, your villain doesn't use the Vanquish action like allies do. Instead, the villain uses a mechanic called Clashing to defeat heroes. Clashing is a very vital strategy for most villains in Anime Villainous, so it's very important to understand and utilize it. The way Clashing works is that your villain can defeat a hero if they're both at the same location. However, there are some important rules regarding Clashing. First of all, your villain has to have equal or more strength than the hero they're trying to defeat, just like when using allies for a Vanquish. However, unlike allies, a clash only involves your villain and the hero. You can't add on the strength of allies to your villain, even if they're at the same location. Likewise, you can't use the strength value of your villain to help an ally when using them for a Vanquish action. On top of all that, you cannot take actions after you clash. This means even if you clash with a hero, defeat them, and that uncovers the top actions at your location, you cannot use those top actions this turn. Basically, Anime Villainous has its turns work in phases. The first phase is moving your villain mover, the second phase is performing your actions, and then the third phase is clashing, followed by the fourth phase, which is just ending your turn. You can't go back to the action-taking phase after you've already clashed in the clashing phase. The exception to this, however, is if you have used a card that allowed you to clash. Some villains will have cards that say to clash with a hero or something similar. This is done during the performing action phase because you played a card to do it, not during the actual clash phase. Speaking of which, you can only clash with one hero in the clash phase. Even if there are 2 heroes at your location and you can defeat both of them with a clash, you have to choose one hero to clash with and leave the other one. Again, the exception to this is using a card to clash. If you used a card to clash with a hero during your turn, you can still clash with another hero during your actual clash phase. Now, there's only one last thing we have to cover before you've got all the know-how to play Anime Villainous, and that's how to actually win the game. You probably thought that completing your objective is all you have to do, and once you've done that, you're the victor. But that is not the case in Anime Villainous. Completing your objective doesn't win you the game. Instead, it puts your villain into their showdown. When your villain has completed their objective, you take one of those fancy showdown tiles I mentioned way back at the start of the video. You then put that showdown tile over top of your villain's objective so that it's clear to everyone you have entered showdown. Once your villain has entered Showdown, you're just one step away from winning your game of Anime Villainous. To complete Showdown and claim victory, you must end your turn with no heroes in your territory. If even one hero is still alive to carry on the Torch of Hope, then your villain hasn't won yet. Those pesky heroes will end up staging a rebellion, or getting stronger after some sort of time skip, or potentially even having a sequel or spin-off where they defeat your villain. It's very important to realize that you complete Showdown and win the game by ending your turn with no heroes in your territory, not starting your turn with no heroes. This means it's entirely possible that you'll end up entering Showdown and winning the game in the same turn. Showdown can be as quick as less than a turn depending on how you've played and how the game is gone. Every villain in Anime Villainous has to go through Showdown to win, so if you see someone is getting close to completing their objective, it may be a good idea to just focus on throwing heroes into their territory so that their Showdown will take a bit longer. Also very important to note is that you cannot be taken out of Showdown. Once your villain completes their objective and you put the Showdown tile over it, it cannot be removed by anything. An easy example of this is the villain Merrick Ishtar from Yu-Gi-Oh! His objective is to attach the 3 God cards to himself. So what happens if Merrick gets all 3 God cards, enters Showdown, but then one of the God cards gets unattached from him? The answer is nothing. Merrick is still in Showdown, and all he has to do is defeat all heroes in his territory to win the game. So with that, I believe we've covered everything that you need to know to start playing Anime Villainous. If you have any other questions about the game, please leave a comment with your questions, and I'll answer it for you. If it's a question even I don't know the answer to, I'll ask the other guys on the Anime Villainous team that actually made the game, and we'll both get to learn something. If you have questions about specific characters in the game, please check out my upcoming individual Anime Villainous how-to videos. I'll have a link in the description to the playlist where I'll be doing a more in-depth look into each villain in the game. Feel free to leave more character-specific questions in those comment sections as well. Thank you for watching this video, and for your interest in Anime Villainous. A lot of great people put a lot of work into this fan project, so I hope you enjoy playing the game. I also hope to see you for future videos on the channel, Anime Villainous or otherwise. Until then, farewell.